So, hello and welcome back yet again to me recapping yet another chapter of The Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory, two wonderful authors who have given us a delightful series that I hope you're enjoying at least the recaps. If you can actually find the books, I really recommend them. I mean, I'm doing the best I can with the recaps, but it's never quite as awesome as actually reading the books, which is one of those deep regrets for me. Anyway, we left off with Harrier and Tercel arguing a little bit, and with Harrier telling kind of a big lie to his best friend. He does not tell Tercel his actual mage price. I kind of understand that because I'm sure if he had, Tercel would be like, excuse me? No, this is not cool. But yeah, Tercel is not doing amazing. But despite that, they're still planning on, I guess you could say, bearding the wild mage Bisochim in his own lair. Tercel isn't exactly sure that he can do anything because without Ankeldar, he has no real amount of magic, and he isn't quite sure that he believes Harrier, and by proxy believes Kerta, that Ankeldar has to be alive somewhere still because the bond is still intact, but you know, it is what it is. And so that was kind of where we left off. Harrier did tell Tercel that no, really, it was not a bad mage price to summon Kerta and get this answer. He just has to give up his 3 books. So come on, let's head off to the Lake of Fire, and that is where we left them. On a around here note, it's beginning to feel a lot like late autumn. And surprisingly, now that we are having cooler weather, the trees are responding. We're starting to get some color. I might have to take us out on a walk just to look at the trees, which are now deciding to put on a little bit more of a show. I was out on a walk earlier and I had to stop because there was just one section of trees. I'll try to remember to post the picture on my Instagram, but there was one section of trees across the lake from me that was just blazing in color. It was very, very pretty. Unfortunately, because it's also the season when the trees are shedding all their leaves, a lot of the color is on the ground. There are drifts of beautifully colored autumn leaves, kind of a precursor of the snow that we'll get, but much, much more colorful. Anyway, with all of that, it is time for us to recap chapter 3. Just one chapter because this is another fairly long one, and I feel like I'm going to be reading whole chunks of it because there's just so much in it. So we're going to jump into chapter 3 of The Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory, A Journey into Darkness. So, Harrier and Tercel, they are going to be heading off to hopefully find the Lake of Fire. And Shariah has already said that she is coming with them, and she begins to make her preparations. Quoting, "For the journey along the Dove Road, Shariah drew ruthlessly upon the wealth of the tribe. 10 shotars, more than half of their remaining stock, 1 of their 3 tents, water skins, knives, meat, meal, blankets, salt, if she traveled alone, or even in the company of those who were not Nalzindar but still Isvani, Shariah would not have made her preparations with such elaborate care. But those she meant to escort to a place where even Nalzindar did not go were soft northern boys who had never even seen a desert a handful of moon turns ago. If each day there were 100 ways for a fool to die in the Isvai, well, there were 1,000 for a sage to die in the Barileth. So she's doing what she thinks is going to be impossible. She doesn't really think that they stand a lot of a chance, but she's trying to give them the best chance she can by making preparations that for a regular trip would be considered excessive. As she's getting ready, she thinks about these two northern boys. It was easy to summon up anger with Tercel, harder to quench it. He flaunted his loss like a toddling child with its first bruise, sulking and fasting as if he had taken a mortal wound, then crying danger and failure in a voice loud enough to be heard from one end of the camp to the other. Bad enough that the loss of the Star-Crowned meant the loss of their greatest weapon against the Tainted One, but far worse that Tercel should cause her people to fear their home, for there was no other refuge for the Nalzindar if they left Abi Abadashar. And to think that Bisochim might yet seek them out in this place was a hard thing to bear. But though he displayed his fear and his grief and even his anger as no Nalzindar ever would, Tercel summoned up to set beside them the courage and determination of a man grown. For even weaponless, he meant to continue down the path the gods of the wild magic had put his feet upon. And where Tercel went, Harrier must follow. She thinks for a little while how she'd never actually intended on falling in love. She was planning on, just being single for her whole life. She had never met anybody that she liked until Harrier showed up. She isn't quite sure at this point that it is love, and she knows that, wow, he's also a wild mage, in her people's parlance, a blue robe. And the blue robes, at least in Isvani culture, are not really ones to get married. They might dally with you for a while. They might spend a few seasons with you. They might even, live with you for a span of years. But amongst the Isvai, the blue robes do not claim any tribe or tent, and that worries her a little bit. Harrier was like no blue robe Shariah had ever met. He did not come to them with wise counsel beneath his tongue. More than that, he swore loud and long that he was a fool in all things, so much so that it had taken her many days to see that he wasn't. His protestations of foolishness were a disguise, nothing more, just as the dappled scales of the desert adder, the dun fur of the shenshu or others, served to hide predator and prey against the sands. It was true that Harrier had much ignorance. He had as little knowledge of the desert and its ways as Tercel did. True, equally, that the wild magic had not held him in its embrace even a full wheel of the seasons, and that he spoke of it as one who thought of it as a thing that must be mastered, the way a rider masters an unruly shotar rather than a thing that simply was, like air, sand, and fire. He brawled and complained, and he went through all of his days, as far as Shirai could tell, bawling like an overladen shotar about whatever crossed his mind. Quick to complain, quick to argue, and quick to take offense. So that is the bad that she knows of Harrier, but she also knows a lot of good. But if all these things were true, then it was true also that the ignorance and foolishness that he boasted of did not gall him, for he was always willing to turn hand and eye to any new thing with eagerness and joy. And if he wrestled with the wild magic, then he did so in love. For many times since he had come to them, its wisdom had spoken through him to save the Nalzindar from such trials as their new home set before them. As quick as he was to argue, he was as quick to turn away from an argument. If he took offense quickly, he was just as quick to forgive. And if he complained constantly, Shariah had quickly realized that it was either about trivial matters that he could set right himself, cold tea, a wrinkled sleeping mat, or about matters so vast no one could change them at all, like the desert heat or the brightness of the sun. And so it was that she would take the two of them where they must go, even though it was a journey upon whose road only ran in one direction. So, despite the fact that she wasn't sure about Tercel and Harrier, at least when she met them, and despite the fact that she definitely likes Harrier a lot more than Tercel, she's willing to put herself in harm's way to help them. And so it's the morning that they are going to be departing, and they come out. They see the Shotars, all of the supplies, and Harrier counts and realizes that 4 of the camels slash Shotars are saddled. And he's like, who else is coming? There's one for me, one for you, one for Tercel, and that is answered rather quickly because Sinarin, who is Shariah's best friend, age mate, and not quite second in command, but definitely favorite person in the Nalzindar, comes out along with Tercel. They argue with Shariah. Harrier's already pointed out that they pretty much are banking that this is a one-way trip, and it's bad enough that the 3 of them are going to probably be going to certain death. But does Sinarin have to come? Shariah cut them off. Do you mean me to do all of the work of the camp by myself? To set a tent is not the work of one pair of hands. Can you help me? She asked Tercel. Can you? She asked Harrier. I can learn, Harrier told her. Not quickly enough to save us from death. And when we come to the place of fire, the army of Xanatar will be there. At least that's what we believe. You cannot convince them that you were born to the tent of any tribe, nor can Tercel, and all will wish to know who you are and how you've gotten there. Harrier hadn't really thought that far, and Shariah points out that she and Sinarin, posing as their wives or something along those lines, will speak for them. Tercel's like, yeah, we can pretend that we're your brothers or something. And Shariah's like, look, if anyone looks at you guys close enough to see that you look nothing like the Nalzindar, we're dead anyway. So let me show you how to put on your chadar, which is like, I guess it's called a burnous, a turban, basically. Something to shield you from the sun and keep the sand out of your face. And so, thus disguised, they head out towards what Shariah calls the Dove Road because it runs as straight as a dove would fly. And they're going along. They're leaving at night because if you are wise in the desert, you don't travel by day. And Harrier and Tercel, they at least see the logic of that. But what they don't see the logic of is that Harrier, with his amazing time sense, knows that there's a few hours before dawn, and Shariah's stopping. "Shariah, why are we stopping?" said Harrier. "It's an hour at least till dawn, and 3 till it's really hot. We should keep going." It was, so Shariah reminded herself, a question born of ignorance, and ignorance of a kind she could hardly imagine. But even though Harrier had spent the last moon turn in Abiyabadashar, he had rarely been upon the desert's face in full daylight, and when he was, he had always known he was only footsteps from shelter and water. "A Shotar may go a se'nnight without drinking, 10 days if it has wet forage, a fortnight without food and water, and it will die. The Dove Road is 6 days from Abiyabadashar. I know not when we will reach the first well. It is best to spare the Shotar's strength and ours." And with that, they set up their tent for the first night. And the next several pages are just traveling and the fact that they're very, very hot and very, very thirsty pretty much all the time. And even worse is that outside of Abiyabadashar, 6 days out, Tercel realizes that he's also dreaming again. And that's not good at all. Tercel thinks to himself, he was sore from long nights spent riding through the freezing cold. A Shotar was nothing like a horse, and nothing at all like riding Ankeldar. He wouldn't think about Ankeldar, his friend, his partner, someone he had never thought to meet, and who completed him in ways that he had never imagined, and who was gone, and there was nothing Tercel could do about it. He was filthy, sweltering all day in the tent, and then putting on the same clothes every night. Both Tercel and Harrier had spent most of their last year sleeping on the ground, and it was hardly fair that 6 days of desert travel, mostly by night, should have burned every inch of their exposed skins red and raw, left their lips and the skins of their hands cracked and bleeding. Cinnarin told them it was because the air was very dry and Ishanin dust carried far. Ishanin dust is like a alkaline dust, which sounds terrible, just FYI. Like salt and alkaline on the skin and not being able to bathe does sound completely miserable. And Tercel is just tired. He is absolutely exhausted. He's tired of being the champion of light, and he's really tired of just about everything. And he's starting to fray. Harrier is also pretty miserable. Harrier couldn't decide which part of the last se'nnight had been less fun. Watching Tercel fall back apart the way he had been before they had left the Arameth, a gaunt, hollow-eyed sleepwalker who had stumbled and shambled and had to be spoken to 2 or 3 times before answering, or if falling apart that way himself was worse. He had thought that he had known what the desert was like, but he had been wrong. He had even gone out into the desert in the middle of the day and sat out there until he had to go back in, but that wasn't quite the same as being out there full time. His lips are bleeding, his hands are bleeding, the Ishanan in the wind is making everything hurt, and both boys are completely miserable. But thankfully, on the 7th night of their travel, they reach the first well, and it's not much, but it's better than nothing. Harrier actually dumps an entire water skin over his head, and that scene kind of makes me laugh because neither Sinarin or Shariah can ever imagine like a bath. The Isvani and the Nalzindar do sweat baths, which is quite common amongst a lot of different like tribal people, according to the things I've seen. So she can't actually imagine like a bath, but they are very happy to at least get a drink. And like I said, Tercel is again, like he was in the beginning, trying to avoid sleeping because now that he's outside of the wards of the ancient elven city, he's dreaming again. He was conscious and aware, just as he always was in these dreams, but this time he could neither see nor feel. He simply was, aware and present. And somehow it was natural to have none of his normal senses, as if either he didn't possess those abilities, or as if there were nothing here to see or feel. Tercel wasn't sure which, but surely if whatever he was normally lacked those senses, he wouldn't possess knowledge and memory of them, right? But he did. And so he could tell that he was not simply blind and deaf. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, and nothing anywhere to feel. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. But if he lacked normal senses of perception, he had something that took their place. And with these other senses, he could tell that he wasn't alone, surrounded by others like him. Well, like the thing that he was dreaming he was. Others possessed of boundless inhuman appetites, and Tercel was trying as hard as he could not to know what they thought and wanted, but that only meant that his thoughts focused more on where he was. And the thing about that was it didn't seem to exist except in relation to someplace else, someplace the others wanted to get to, a place that they had either never been or hadn't been for a long time, and they wanted out so very much. Suddenly, he could no longer hold back from knowing what these others around him were and what he was dreaming he was. He began to thrash and scream, only realizing as he woke fully that Harrier was lying on top of him with his hand over Tercel's mouth. "No more water for you," said Harrier. "Obviously, you can't handle the stuff." Tercel tries to articulate his dream. He doesn't dignify that whole "no more water for you" thing because Harrier's trying to make a joke that the fact that they had gotten to the well and all drank their fill obviously just made Tercel a little water happy, but Tercel's not having it. And he tries to articulate that what he seems to have seen of these demons, proto and darkened, whatever they are, seem to be in another dimension that's like his younger sister's puzzle boxes. And Harrier doesn't quite understand that, but he's like, "So you think the Undarkened are in a puzzle box?" And Tercel says, "I think there are a lot of worlds, not just this one. I think they're all inside each other somehow. I think the Undarkened want to get from theirs to ours because they like it better here. And I think they need someone, Bisochim maybe, to line all the worlds up together correctly before they can get out." Harrier snorted. "Oh, well, if that's all, we can all go home now." Tercel actually managed to force himself to smile at Harrier's black joke. They both knew that no matter how bizarre and incredible the thing was that he had just tried to describe, it was also, if it wasn't possible, then neither of them would be there. Shariah, on the other hand, just wants them to shut up and go back to sleep. Because she knows what the desert is like, and she knows that you have to rest when you can. 10 days after that, nobody has any time to argue. They don't have any energy to argue. Tercel has been dreaming nightly, well, daily. Every time he lays down to sleep or to try to sleep, he's back in that darkened puzzle box area. He's miserable, and so he's trying not to sleep at all. Harrier is also miserable, hot, everybody, and worried about Tercel, so he's not sleeping much, and they're in a bad way. Even Sinarin and Shariah are not really doing the greatest because nobody does the greatest while trying to travel across a place where nothing lives. Harrier knew they had to do something. To arrive at the Lake of Fire, exhausted and staggering from lack of sleep, would be almost like not having come at all. Just because he couldn't see how they could possibly win a fight against Bisochim didn't mean that they should just show up and fall down unconscious at his feet. He was just too exhausted to think of any way of doing anything other than that. They had begun their journey in the dark of the moon. 16 days later, the moon was almost full, its light turning the desert white. Harrier knew that Shariah thought that brightness meant that they could be too easily seen by their enemies. Harrier was resigned to knowing that they weren't going to be able to sneak up on anybody. The Barileth was as flat as a tabletop. The road they were on was the only one leading to the Lake of Fire. And Tercel no longer had the ability to cast spells to make people look any other way. They were going to be seen. And so with that frame of mind, they're heading almost, they're hoping anyway, to their destination. Tercel, as they go to sleep that day, senses something. He doesn't know what, and he also thinks that he still has hope that maybe when they get to the Lake of Fire, he can just reason with this Bisochim person, but he has no idea. He always tried to stay awake as long as he could, even though the combination of the morning heat and his constant weariness bludgeoned him into unconsciousness eventually. But once he was asleep, the visions began. His constant attempts to escape from them would keep him struggling towards wakefulness for the rest of the day. But today, not even the heat kept him awake, because the itchy, uncomfortable, frightening knowing in the back of his head was now gone, as if his skull were a house that he had unwillingly shared for a better part of a year, and the other presence had suddenly decided to leave. Oh, that can't be good, Tercel thought vaguely. But the mixture of relief and exhaustion was so great it dragged him into real sleep before he could manage to rouse himself and give an alarm. And I don't know what he could have done based on the rest of this chapter to give an alarm. But basically, that sense of the endarkened, the reason he's been having the visions, suddenly disappears. And if you think back to 2 chapters ago, you kind of know why, because we are now catching up with where the chapter 2 chapters ago ended, where Aniran, the spirit of elemental darkness given flesh by Bisochim, is now free of the endarkened puzzle box that she's been locked in. Tercel wakes up abruptly because Harrier is shaking him and yelling at him to go get the Shotars. Everybody's kind of freaking out, and Tercel's like, "What's up?" And Harrier's like, "There's something bad. Something bad is coming. Hurry up." And so they look around, and Tercel and Harrier can tell what's coming because they've lived their whole lives in the cold north, so they've seen thunderstorms. Sinarin, Shariah, and the Shotars have never seen a thunderstorm. The boys try to reassure Sinarin and Shariah, but they're scared. The Shotars are utterly freaking out because now, on top of the wind and the heavy oppressive feeling that comes before a thunderstorm, there's thunder, there's lightning, and then suddenly the air was not only wet and cold, but filled with rain. Within seconds, the wind had become a gale. It was as dark as twilight now, and the rain was coming down with hurricane force. The sky was stitched by blinding flashes of lightning, and Tercel completely lost sight of Shariah and her Shotar. He shouted for them, but he couldn't even hear his own voice over the sound of the storm. He was drenched and freezing. He couldn't remember the last time he had been cold, and the worst part was he really couldn't imagine that there was any good reason for this storm to have happened. Just bad reasons. On his trip from Armethale, look, I did it in the right way, to Centaur Shadin, he and Harrier had nearly frozen to death in the middle of the summer because Tercel had been attacked by magic. That had been before he understood anything about what was going on, the danger that the world was in, and the party was expected to save it. At the time, he had only been horrified that so many people might have died by something he could have been responsible for, and still that part was horrifying. But this time, a part of Tercel wanted to laugh because once again, just as back in the beginning, he was so far from being a threat to the dark that there was nothing Tercel could do but laugh. And at the same time, a traitorous part of him wanted to have hope. Because if the dark was spending so much energy trying to destroy him, then maybe he was still a threat after all. Now, there Tercel has a little bit of conceit, but it's very understandable because we know from 2 chapters ago that Bisochim is not trying to deal with Tercel right now. He has woken up to the fact that he's been deceived and that he has I'm not going to say unwittingly, but that he has unleashed darkness upon the world, and he's merely trying to contain that darkness and failing pretty miserably. He's trying to also save his people, and we'll see if he succeeds or fails at that. But Tercel understandably thinks that this storm is being sent at him and Harrier. I would say Harrier probably agrees with that thought and is also thinking the same thing. And so Harrier goes one direction because their Shotars are completely panicking. Sinarin and Shariah are scattered, and Tercel has completely scattered. He doesn't know where anybody is. And he keeps thinking about Ankeldar. And he keeps thinking that he just wants to go home. And he also realizes, because you've come to these realizations in the stupidest of times, and this definitely counts as one of those, that he's pretty sure that Harrier lied to him. Now he's starting to think that maybe Harrier lied about even summoning Kerta, because he's been best friends with Harrier for a long time, and something that's been bothering him for a while, I guess now that he doesn't have the endarkened presence in the back of his head anymore, hits him, and he realizes that Harrier had definitely lied about something, and Harrier doesn't lie well. Tercel had never been so miserable in his life. Cold, pain, exhaustion, guilt, failure. Those were all painful and almost impossible to bear, but suspecting his lifelong friend was worse. Harrier and everybody are definitely lost. And finally Tercel just his Shotar stops panicking because it runs out of energy and it just plops down in the mud. I mean, it's better than running because Tercel managed to injure himself trying to stay on a freaking out Shotar, but it's finally stopped. It's still kind of drizzling, and once Tercel's Shotar stops, Harrier finds Tercel. And Tercel's like, "So how'd you find me?" And Harrier's like, "I'm a wild mage. What do you think? I did a finding spell to locate Shariah. As soon as my Shotar was willing to move, we went and got her. And then I did another finding spell to find you." He rubbed his head again. And Tercel's like, "Why do you keep rubbing your head? Did you hit your head?" "Are you all right?" said Tercel. Harrier looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "You can't feel it," he said. Whatever he saw on Tercel's face made him grimace and continue speaking, raising his voice a little to be heard over the rain. "I guess high magic must be good for something if it means you can't sense this, because something woke me up right before the weather started turning. It's like something stinks, or scraping a nail down a chalkboard, or biting a rotten plum, or all at once." And Tercel drew a deep breath and tried to control his fear. "It's the dark," he said. "That's what you're feeling." "We're too late," I thought. "I was wrong. That's what the storm means. We're too late." "Yeah, I figured that out for myself," said Harrier. "So what do we do now?" If they had been alone, if they had been standing face to face, Tercel would have tried to hit him. He didn't know which he was most at the moment, frightened or angry or grief-stricken, but most of all, the only thing Tercel thought was, how dare he ask me to make a decision like this? Harrier and Tercel are probably almost at their closest point to actually fighting right now. I think a lot of it is just exhaustion. I know when you're tired and hungry and miserable, you get mad at everything, but these guys have been running on adrenaline and hope for the better part of a year, and I'm honestly surprised it took them this long to almost come to blows. Right as Tercel is making up his mind to maybe go and try to punch Harrier in the face, even though he knows that Harrier would probably beat the tar out of him since he's a night mage and all, Sinarin says, "Look, the sun!" It's not the sun, but it's something. And I am actually going to read the entire rest of this chapter. It's only a couple of paragraphs because they're here. For the last 10 days, they had been heading straight south along a road beaten into the desert by the pads of thousands of Shotars and marked by the unnatural wells sunk by a wild mage who somehow had the power not only to do that, but to convince thousands of his Vi that their city-dwelling brethren were monsters that needed to be exterminated. They hadn't known that this was happening when there was anyone that they could ask how it was possible. Shariah said that Bisochim was shadow-touched, and Tercel believed, until today, that there would be time to reach the Lake of Fire before Bisochim could summon the darkness back. If Bisochim wasn't already shadow-touched, Tercel hadn't thought it mattered how he could have accomplished these things, and Harrier, night mage or not, didn't know enough about magic to ask the right questions. They should have cared. Tercel realized that now. He should have cared about a lot of things. Well, he still had Ankeldar to help him. The wells in the Barileth, the Isvani being turned into an army, the wards that kept Ankeldar from reaching the Lake of Fire, even Harrier being called to the wild magic. They were all warnings, and he had missed every one. The air was shimmering with water, but Tercel could see the bright band of green in the distance, and above that, the black ridge of a cliff. A tall plume of white billowed up from the top of the cliff, as brilliant and substantial looking as the summer thunderheads high in the sky back home. But there was never any green in the Barileth, nor had that ridge been there when they had stopped this morning. Sorcery, Shariah growled. Harrier laughed, and the sound held so much despair that Tercel instantly forgot his anger. He knows, Tercel thought. He knows what this means. No, said Tercel quietly, before Harrier said anything. It's the end of sorcery. That, what we can see, it was always there. We just couldn't see it until now. And with that, Harrier, Shariah, Tercel, and Sinarin have arrived at the Lake of Fire, and unfortunately, as Tercel just realized, they have arrived too late. I mean, we know there's a whole lot more. There's still that much more of the book left, so we're not in complete despair yet, but I think Tercel and Harrier are probably getting close to despair, because it looks like the dark is winning. It looks like the dark might have just plain old won. And considering we have 3/4 of the book left to go, I guess we'll have to see what happens next. Thank you for joining me. Don't be too mad at Tercel. I remember thinking by the time I got into this part of the book that he might not be my best character. He might not be my favorite character, but I think on this recapping / read through that I'm doing, I'm giving him a lot more grace. Now that it's really hitting me that, I mean, I couldn't deal with the stuff he's dealing with. The absolute, like, overwhelming and PTSD of everything that they've gone through. I would be curled up in a corner and glibbering and crying. So the fact that he's still up and standing and going through at least the motions of everything, I give him a lot more respect and a lot more grace on this read through to recap these books. Anyway, let me know what you think, and I will see you guys later.